Good evening, everyone. A very warm welcome to this Convergence Science Network event at the Bio21 Institute, and a special welcome to those joining us online. I'm Luan Ismail, the network convener. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which this event is taking place, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay respect to elders past and present. We're living through a major revolution in the biomedical sciences. Each day brings announcements about new knowledge and understanding of human disease, from personalised cancer treatments to gene therapies, nanomedicines, stem cell therapies, brain implants restoring movement, to advances in imaging technology and more. The biomedical sciences offer new hope that therapies to some of the most challenging conditions are not far off. For the first time in several generations, biomedical scientists were at the forefront of the world's attention in responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. This attention has led some to suggest that public trust in the biomedical sciences has been diminished. This evening, we will not conduct a forensic examination of what scientists got right and wrong about COVID-19. Some of the debate is ongoing. This evening we will delve into some of the issues surrounding trust in the biomedical sciences so we can have a better understanding of this complex behaviour, shed light on the workings of the science, which is often shielded from public view, and how the science is communicated. We will be taking questions at the end. For those of you here in the audience and those of you joining us online, please use the chat function to put your questions. I'd now like to introduce the panel for this discussion. Dr. Denise Goodwin is a co-director of Health and Social Programs at Behaviour Works Australia. Professor Santa Pasricha is the acting Deputy Director of the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute of Medical Research, and Fron Jackson-Webb is the Deputy Editor of The Conversation and its Health Lead. Welcome. May I ask each of you to briefly tell us a little about who you are and what you do? Can we start with you, Fron?
Yeah. So I'm the Health Editor of The Conversation. So I joined The Conversation before we launched about 12 years ago. Since then we have grown from a bunch of 6 or 7 journalists sitting around a table calling up academics and researchers, asking them to write for something that didn't really exist. 12 years later, we are an international independent news outlet. We attract about 8 million readers a month and 16 million readers a month, including republishers. Our work is really about engaging with academics and researchers to tap into their knowledge and to tap into their research and communicate that to a lay audience in an interesting and accessible way. I'm also the deputy editor of the site, so I do some management, hiring, strategic outlooks, that sort of thing. Before The Conversation, I worked for the Australian Medical Association, managing their Victorian media office. I was a little baby journalist comms officer then, and I spent some time in London before that. So I've been at The Conversation for most of my working life, but I still love it. Every day is very different.
Great, thank you.
Santa.
So yeah, my name's Sam Train. Lots of people call me Santa. I'm a clinician scientist, so I work as a doctor. I'm a blood doctor, a haematologist. So I look after patients with a range of blood diseases in the Royal Melbourne Hospital. And then I'm also a scientist, and I work in really 2 types of research. I have a lab at the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute where we work on experimental science around anemia, nutrition, iron biology, and we work on a range of different types of experiments, but also run clinical trials. So we have a number of international clinical trials that we work on testing interventions for anemia. And on top of that, I'm also, these days, also a member of the leadership team at WeHire as it undergoes its leadership transition.
Thank you. Denise.
Yeah, hello, I'm Denise Goodwin. I am the co-director of the Health and Social Programmes at Behaviour Works Australia, which is based at the Monash Sustainable Development Institute at Monash University. Our focus is on behaviour change and behaviour change for social good. I'll add that in because I think we've become a little bit demonised as well at the moment in terms of behaviour change and where that space is in behavioural science. A lot of our work is really around who needs to do what differently and how we can help enable those systems. So understanding why people do the things they do and then looking at some of the mechanisms or levers that we can actually work with to try and help behaviour change, but for social good, as I said. We do a lot of work with medical institutes, hospitals, places like that, but also on a social level. So we do a lot around social inclusion and working with marginalised groups and a whole array of people in different organisations. So our work really goes across a wide range of areas, both within the public health system and beyond. But as I say, yeah, all of our work is centred around behavioural science. I also, as a background, come from a systems science, so my background was actually in systems thinking. So I add that layer into, yes, we've got the behavioural science, but how does that sort of lower level thinking of why people do the things they do here actually fit within a much bigger picture within the social system that's going on? So that's the lens that we really bring to a lot of our work these days.
Thank you, Denise. Could I start with you by asking you, what is trust? How do you define trust?
What is it's, to be honest, typical behavioural scientist, I will take the viewpoint of what is trust. It's one of those things that is made up of a lot of conscious and unconscious thinking, or by the way we are, what makes up our being and the perceptions of our world. So trust is definitely something that sits within, from our own perceptions. I do believe, obviously, there's external things that we're aware of that will then influence our trust, but we also have a lot of unconscious things going in within our mind, that our biases, the way we do things, how we see the world, which actually makes up the globe of trust and what we believe is trust. Social norms and everything like that, certainly within different cultures, comes in massively, and that's a huge piece of the work that we actually look at, is social norming and how that helps to form trust within our being or society or the space that we're in that moment in time.
So how do we distinguish between trust and a belief? When these two sort of feelings, if you like, collide, how do people decide whether to trust someone based on some prior belief that they may have?
It's a difficult one because within all of these concepts there's such blurred lines, even though they have distinct definitions between them. The blurred lines between them make it very, very difficult, certainly when we're looking at why people do the things they do. So our belief system sometimes doesn't always transpire into what we actually do, so our behaviours. So we might have a whole load of beliefs that means that we don't do something or we do something, but actually it doesn't always translate into doing something right or wrong, if that makes sense. So when we're actually looking at the beliefs that people have, what we often find is there's this linear expectation that if we have an attitude or a belief that will automatically influence our behaviour and what we do, and we know that not to be true. For example, we might all think that recycling is a really good thing, and we might believe and trust in the systems that are around those types of areas, but does that mean that we all do the behaviours and the things that we need to do in order to make sure that comes about? Definitely not. Now in health it becomes a little bit more blurred, I think, in environment and some of those areas, which again there's a lot of trust that comes into that sphere as well. There's a lot of debate as to whether or not the beliefs and attitudes actually do form then into the behaviours and the way that we want people to act and be within society. But the belief systems are definitely there. They definitely drive why we do the things they do. It's how we can actually then use other mechanisms to try and influence those trust and the belief systems that are there. I don't believe that if people have certain beliefs or trusts that they can't be changed, but also we need to understand where those people are coming from. So just because it's a dichotomy or something we don't believe in, how do we actually bring people along on a journey or listen to them and everything like that, rather than create these barriers, which is often what happens. And that's where the mistrust can really stem from. in a lot of these circumstances, or certainly from what we see.
Do we know what impact COVID has had on, the question of trust?
I think
there's
we all know it's had a huge impact, and part of that is because in the systems that we have, so if we're talking about the development even of vaccines, and let's be honest, the trust in vaccines, whether or not we believe them or not, that is a whole other panel in itself, really. However, the speed in which, just as one example, the speed in which vaccines were developed meant that people really had a mistrust. Hang on a minute, it normally takes years to get to that point. What we probably didn't do very well is say, well, actually the money being pumped into these systems and the types of things and way things are being developed is very different, but that wasn't being communicated very well to the general public. So things that we expect and the expectations of things were really being challenged. It was really challenging what we know about a certain area. COVID as well, we were asking people to do things completely out of the ordinary, which, become politicized, really. So America creates these great examples for us as behavioural scientists running workshops and all sorts to be able to say wearing a mask has never become such a political issue. Something where the chief medical officer suddenly become demonised and was used as a bit of a political football because of the action of wearing a mask. And it really started to show, well, you're a Democrat or a Republican, how is wearing a mask suddenly becoming a very political thing? And what the politicising of health was doing was creating mistrust in the system. So it was really being used as something to create, who are you? Who are you? Are you in this group or this group? And creating that dichotomy of what is a very health behaviour that we wanted people to actually perform. And what that also did then through politics, media and everything else is created that level of mistrust in the system that is going to take a very long time to really help to get back as well. So those types of things can be very damaging in the long term to then try and create that trust again, and we've seen that play out in the great example that is America, really, with that one area.
Most people were really unequipped to, assess the science, but people did follow the guidelines that that the government implemented. Does that tell us something about trust in people versus institutions?
It's a difficult one because, again, it comes down to the individual behaviours. So again, as a behavioural scientist, what we tend to do is try and get really down to the nitty-gritty of what are you actually asking people to do? Can we actually be very specific about the target audience and the types of actions that we want to do? Because the more specific we are, the less room there is for misinterpretation and everything like that. And I think in terms of that question there around institutions, I think you start bringing in a whole load of organisational norms and things like that, which actually at the individual level, where there's a whole lot of other things and cultural things going on that influences those individuals. It can make it very difficult to really put those things together, which is also what was happening as we saw that a lot of the behaviours, it became the workplace is asking you to do this, a workplace thing, but then where context matters, is the point I'm trying to get to, of where we are and when we were performing behaviours really mattered. So in some instances, maybe someone didn't want to wear a mask or something like that, but the social norming of where you were, like in our workplace, we wear a mask. In these situations, we do these things. You are required to get a vaccine, etc., etc. So context really matters. And I think it's difficult, certainly as a behavioural scientist, sometimes to sort of pull those things apart. I think looking at it from the individual level, those institution levels definitely had an influence on behaviour. But to put the two together, I don't think you can. I think you've got to pull them apart a little bit more.
Did the fact that there was controversy amongst the science community about vaccines, for example, would that have impacted the public, the personal perception of trust?
Absolutely. When you're seeing a lot of different things being said, of course it does. And in a time of a pandemic, of which we might see another one in our lifetime, who knows? But it is a once in a 100, 200 year event. It's something that we should be better prepped for, but we're not, let's be honest. So in that instance, I'm sorry, can you refer back again to the original question?
I forgot, what was I asking?
The diversity in opinions around vaccine.
Correct, that's
Yeah.
right. Whether that had an impact.
That's it, yeah.
Yes.
So the
Sorry.
diversity around the opinions and vaccines. So absolutely, there was a lot of competition, there was a lot of things going on. We were still trying to find our way, and that was being played out in a very public way. We expect our governments, and we have huge expectations that people should have the answers, and that our scientific community in particular should have all the answers to these things. And I think there could have been better communications potentially around actually showing that we don't know all the answers, we are trying to find our way. We're actually, in some instances in particular, the communication was very definitive, where actually it probably could have been a little bit more inviting and showing that, look, we're finding our way, we're helping, we're here to do this, we care. We get the type of communication that was being used probably could have been softened and changed a little bit, in my opinion, if I'm being honest.
Sorry.
Sorry, just on the last point there, the other thing was the types of communications that we had, a lot of it was focusing on those people that weren't doing what we were asking them to do, where actually what we should have been doing is really commending those people that were, because by pointing out that people weren't doing it, what you're doing is creating a bit of a social norm that that's okay, and there's this whole group that aren't doing these things, where actually if we talk more and more about the right things to be doing, you're more likely to get even those people who are on the fence to be doing those right things. So those people in the middle, you know, that are near that tipping point, they're probably more likely to go towards this end than the other. But we kept pointing out the other end, unfortunately, which did not help the situation whatsoever.
Sandra, as a clinician and researcher, during the COVID experience, was trust an issue that became more top of mind for you and some of your colleagues? And if so, what brought that about?
So, I mean, I think the first thing is to just reflect on that time, and it was a febrile, frightening time for all of us, even for clinicians, for scientists, and of course for the public. And I think I recall, if you just think back to March 2020, when we really knew very little about the virus, although amazingly, the virus had actually, I think around then, been sequenced, and people were able to start developing vaccines. Now, so I think my initial reflection as we heard that was admiration for what we can achieve in such a short period of time. If you just think about what it would have taken, well, we probably, when was the last pandemic in say the 1918 influenza? Obviously they couldn't have developed that sort of platform and that sort of technology. In hours to days, they could take it from a sequence to the ingredients needed to take you forwards to a vaccine. So I recall, as I realised that, actually feeling admiration and thinking, well, at least it's happening now. You know, I'm glad this didn't happen in 1980 or something. It's happening now. And I will sort of mention one other thing, which was, I don't know if you guys get, the notifications on your phone when news comes out, and sometimes something comes and it's just another thing. And I remember sitting at home in lockdown, as we all were. I think it was in late 2020, and the notification came that the first trials of the mRNA vaccine suggested it was going to work. And I called my mum. I was so excited. I was like, it works, it's amazing. So I think actually the initial sense, just thinking about where we were going and how fast things were moving, I think my feeling was around gratitude and excitement about that this was something that we, as a scientific community, internationally, industry, coming together and responding to. Actually, there was unprecedented rates of progress, and the outcome, what we could achieve with that, to restore our society to something, at least clinically, something reflecting normality was the goal. And so actually, yeah, my response to it was that I trusted the biology, understood the biology, and I trusted the way some of the trials were being done, and I trusted the process. So, and I felt gratitude that we had those systems in place and people were able to respond.
Talking about process, can you take us through the scientific method? Because again, that's something that is central to all sort of research, but I think it wasn't that well understood, obviously, by a lot of the public. it's a key component. Can you take us through what is the scientific process
Yeah, sure.
that underpinned a lot of this research and underpins research in the biomedical sciences?
Yeah, so I'm not a COVID researcher or a virologist, so I'll talk more about that in the general sense. And I think that, that's a meta question. We could spend the next hour on that, but just to summarise, I think the scientific process is a structured, rigorous way of asking a question, using some system or model or data to test that question using a preformed approach, and then taking the results of that, analysing them in a way that others would agree makes sense, to see whether what you originally thought is or is not somewhat correct. And then there are statistical rules, which is important that you apply to that allow you to be able to make a claim around the results that you found. And then you can apply that process across the spectrum of research. So you can apply it to cells in a dish that you're doing experiments on, or that you're trying to test whether a medicine or something might have an impact, right through to animal models, and then of course all the way to humans. And through that you might use either studies that test groups of humans and look for differences between what might happen and what exposures there might be and how they might be connected, or even to the form of study that we do, which is a randomised controlled trial, which is where you formally experimentally test medicines or interventions, or it doesn't even have to be medicine, it could be an intervention or even a behavioural intervention, and you do that in a structured way in a population of people. And across all of these, you're testing the hypothesis, collecting your data, and then analysing it, and then showing people what you've found. And then from there you draw your conclusions, and most importantly you also draw your level of certainty in that result. So I have some idea of what I've got, but also I know how well I think I know what I've got.
And of course the whole scientific method is really about gaining knowledge, but also disproving another piece of work. Is that essentially the how we make progress through the scientific method?
Well, I think that certainly there's nothing I like to do more than disprove someone else's piece of work. That's, but I think that's probably a different. I probably wouldn't express it that way. The way there are assumptions around and underlying assumptions about how we think things behave, either at the cellular or experimental physiological level, or in a population, and some of those are based on data, and we know those things well. Some of those are based on data, but the data runs out, and then we make some assumptions, and then some of those we really just feel that must be right. And so you can use the experimental method to test anywhere along that spectrum to see what you've really got, and whether and how, and again, recognizing that what you've done will probably be shown by somebody else in the future to not be as right as you thought it was. So scientists generally hold, in terms of their results, at least in terms of what they work on, they understand it, but I think they also understand what they don't know and what might change, and where the certainty lies and where the uncertainty in what they know is as well. Even within a particular project, there might be experiments that you do along the course of that project where you're pretty happy, that's absolutely fine. But there's other experiments which are more difficult, where you start, or where you just can't do it. There's certain things that just can't be done, where you just have to make a logical set of assumptions or connections and say, this is how I reason that things might work.
There's been a lot of commentary about the replication crisis, and some people have linked that to the issue of the public saying, well, obviously there's an issue within the sciences, I'm less likely to trust it. When you read a peer-reviewed publication, the idea is, I guess, that other scientists can then take that piece of work and try and repeat your experiment and get the same result. Is there enough information usually in a peer-reviewed publication to tell you what the experiment was? Is that the idea of the publication as well?
Yeah, so I think that firstly, just to sort of let the audience know what we're on about here, but the replication crisis, or or in replication crisis is the idea that many scientific experiments and scientific projects, scientific work, papers, if someone else was to do them again, that they might not get the same results, and numbers have been used that number might be quite high. I would first say that there are many reasons. I'll come back to your point, but I just want to sort of emphasize there are many reasons why you might not be able to reproduce someone's work. So the first is they're wrong and you're right. That's the most satisfying. But it might be that you addressed the same set of questions in a different way. And what we see is actually, even when you do clinical trials, and I do clinical trials, we talk about how we summarize clinical trials together, because so often many people have done a similar trial. And when you summarize them, that's called a systematic review, and people can actually statistically analyze it using a statistical approach. And what you can actually see is, even though these are populations of humans given interventions or whatever you've done, you'll actually still see different results even at that highest clinical level of research. And that might be, and the reason for that, and this relates all the way from clinical trials through to experiments in cells, is that there might be differences in the way the experiment was done, but also because, as I said before, when we do science, we come up with a statistical estimate and an uncertainty around that estimate. And the truth when someone says something works by X, what they really mean is it works from, I'm trying to think of the two letters on either side of X in front of you all, but they think, it works. So if X is in the middle, the number is from here to here, and that's the actual result. And so I think that we need to, scientists would think of it in both ways. But the third reason, and maybe what you're getting at, is maybe that there is something problematic about a paper, that it hasn't necessarily been undertaken to the highest standards. So in the top journals now, when we publish, we have to provide say we do a type of blot, which is, say we do a certain experiment, we're not allowed to, for example, do anything to that blot. We have to send pretty much the original scan of that blot to the journal. They may not publish that blot in full because it's pretty ugly, but we still have to show them everything. We need to show them how we came up with the sample size for how we did the experiments and the statistical approach that we did. And we need to, and for, say, a multi-omic experiment, say a big data experiment, commonly now we have to upload the data onto the web. So anyone from here could also have a go at analysing that data. Right. When I do my clinical trials, for the trial we published in Lancet earlier this year, you can all just go and analyse it yourself. It's there. You can have another go at analysing our trial. We also put the statistical analysis plan out. So there's a lot of defence around that is now in place. That's trying to sort of address these issues.
And perhaps crisis is a word that others have used, and maybe what you're suggesting, it isn't really a crisis for the reasons you mentioned. But data is an interesting one. In some other fields of science, they say that they're not able to access, all of the data. You mentioned you publish your data on the web. Is that a requirement of the publishers? Do they set the rules for what information is accessible?
So it depends on the study, and the journal. But so for a study where you were to sequence your data, like generate a lot of sequencing, you would usually now, the standard would be that would need to become public. And increasingly, you actually don't even need to do an experiment to make new insights, because you can actually access that data. Anyone can do it. You can go online and you can download that data and analyse it yourself. So there is immense amounts of data from the hundreds of thousands of scientists in the world who do these sort of experiments that anyone can analyse in their own way. In clinical trials, there is a requirement to at least be able to share the data if you ask for it. But making it online is certainly going a step further. But we were happy to do that for that particular study.
A number of people have mentioned why don't scientists publish experiments that fail, for example, that there's a lot of learning in that saves resources and time. Is there a good reason, Santa, why we haven't seen that yet?
Yeah, well, I'd publish a lot more then. Yes, I think that it would be, I wouldn't disagree with that. I think that at the moment, I think scientists have a mindset that is they're optimists, and we are optimists, and we have a positive discovery mindset. We want to find the new thing, and so when something doesn't work, we're probably, experiments that don't work may not work because you just didn't set up the experiment properly, or they might work because your hypothesis is incorrect. And certainly in the latter case, I would agree with the idea that there should be a simple way to get those out. But we would normally try to make sure that we actually did the experiment right and we were wrong, rather than being lost in the middle is a scary place, is the death zone for a scientist. But I wouldn't disagree that maybe finding a way to get those, does A cause B? No. All right, good. Now I know that. That's because all of us who work in science get really excited by an idea. We suddenly think, oh, this molecule over here and this molecule over there, I reckon they have something to do with each other. I just think they do. And if they did, that'd be amazing. And I'm already dreaming of my Nobel Prize. And I think being able to just say, oh, but this guy did it 2 years ago and it doesn't. All right, I'll go back to bed. That's I think that'll be useful.
This issue of trust has come up recently. The Australian Chief Scientist has put out a paper about trust in science, focusing mainly around integrity. The Australian Academy of Sciences is also going to undertake a sort of study, a review of that issue and make a report. Is that something that the general public should be aware of? Does that indicate that at the highest level that there's concerns about the conduct of science, if you like?
I think I'd phrase it differently, which is that most through their taxes or through their philanthropy, we're very fortunate that we're supported by the Australian public, and we have a responsibility to discharge that responsibility to act responsibly in terms of the quality of our science and to act with integrity. And so I don't think scientists would disagree with the idea that there should be a structured, systematic way for us to understand how we will be dealt with or investigated if there is a concern about the conduct of our work. I'm a clinician. I would never say there shouldn't be a medical board, and I think that, so I think how that should work, and how investigations are undertaken. We already have internal processes that we hire for how we would manage any concerns. But I think having a standardised national approach would be I don't think we're nervous about that idea. Indeed, I think it actually provides some security that there is that there would be a consistent way that this is handled.
Today, many people may not be aware the WEHI made an announcement of a generous philanthropic donation, I think $100 million by the Snow Foundation. That indicates, obviously, a significant level of trust in the ability of the Institute and the scientists to undertake this research that the funding will allow. WEHI also has collaborations with industry. So how does this issue of trust come up in those more, let's call them the more commercial arrangements? How does the issue of trust come up? Is it an issue? How does the commercial entity convince itself or be convinced that they should trust this potential collaborator?
Well, I guess in the first instance, without integrity in how you undertake your research, then researchers don't have much left after that. Because really, what are we doing? We're putting a structured set of thinking into the world, a structured set of data analysis and results, the currency that we work in. So that's the platform that we have to base the organisation or the institutes in the industry on. I think that in terms of trust, from industry, just look, we do partner with industry, and I can elaborate on that in a moment. But just to say, in terms of their trust in us, firstly, I think they usually would they collaborate with scientists in the organisation, so in the institute. So they might say, in my example for us, we're experts in iron biology, how iron is regulated in your body, and we have we have diseases that we work on related to that, and through the work that we've undertaken and the knowledge that we have, we partner with industry who in whom we can achieve things together. So usually it's based on individual scientists having that skill set around the area that industry needs. And then in terms of trust, in terms of the mechanics, we have we provide probably even we have a high standard of record keeping anyway, but probably where we do have a higher standard of record keeping for work that may translate into medicine. And we also have a pretty clear set of responsibilities around the way that our work is regulated and the legal and contractual relationships that we would have to make sure everything is clear.
Mm-hmm. Can I turn to you?
Yes.
You mentioned at the conversation you engage with scientists to essentially put in lay terms the work that they're doing. Can you tell us about what response are you getting in terms of, and who is the public that you serve? More importantly, is it other scientists or people
No.
from other professions or people who are in the various sciences, because you cover all of the, not just sciences, you cover the humanities as well.
Yeah, so we cover politics, business, education, energy and environment, arts, books, ideas, so right across the board, and we target the general public. So we want to talk to the people who, no longer buy the newspaper, no longer tune into the radio in the morning. Instead, we want them to be, opening up our newsletter at 6:30 in the morning and hearing directly from the experts themselves rather than kind of going through the traditional media channels where journalists are, being gatekeepers, have a lot more control over what goes out. The media crisis of the kind of 2000s, where the rivers of gold that came from the classifieds advertising, they all dried up. There was less money to spend on hiring journalists. There was less money to keep experienced journalists in the newsrooms. So, over the last 20 years, the experience has largely left. You've got junior journalists who are, sometimes covering multiple rounds.
Mm-hmm.
They don't have the experience that they used to, oftentimes. And they're pumping out stories, for print, they're doing videos, they're doing everything. The expectation is so high. Talking about trust, I guess the trust is lowered because what they're producing, the quality, I think, has overall lowered. There are some excellent science and health journalists in this country, and especially at the moment, I think. But that really led to the development of the conversation as something different that puts ideas first, that puts the power back into the academic and researchers' hands so that they can really, they don't have full control in that, they work with us professional journalists to get their work out there, but they have final sign-off. They don't have to be worried about being taken out of context or whether they can distill their, latest scientific findings into like a 10-second soundbite or something like that. The conversation was really developed so that people who have big ideas can have a space to explain them, and they can also outline the evidence to support those claims. Readers can click through and they can look at the studies that back up what they're saying.
How do you compete, if I can use that's the right term, with social media, where scientists can obviously engage through that medium? Anyone else can have a say. How do you deal with? You have a social media presence as well, obviously, but how do you deal with the general concept of social media, where people can post anything that they like, and obviously some people use it as a cause for this misinformation, disinformation. You can put anything out there. You have higher standards though.
Yeah.
But do you see social media as a contributor to this issue of trust in some way?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a threat, but I think that it really reinforces for our readers the importance of going to an organisation that delivers evidence-based analysis and news, a brand that is trusted, a brand that they know has been rigorously fact-checked, that corrects things when they're wrong. I think that people know that social media is a bit of a free-for-all, and if you want your own ideas reinforced, then there will be someone out there who will do that for you. And as media is becoming more niche and social media is incredibly niche, people can always find a platform that reinforces their own beliefs. But I think they come to the conversation because they want their worldview widened, and they are genuinely curious about what's happening, and they want to know. They want good information that helps inform the decisions that they're making day to day. And during COVID, it was, or just today, for instance, this week, they want to know things like, what are these new COVID vaccines? Can I get one? Are they any better than the old ones? Are my rat tests that I've got in the cupboard, are they still working? Should I get out the mask and wear that now that there's a bit more COVID around? So they have questions about how to live their life, and they want to understand the science behind it so that they can make their own decisions about those things. But they need a bit of guidance, they need to be directed towards good evidence, and they need, I guess, it to be packaged up in an interesting way that's not infotainment, but they need a nice read as well to keep them interested.
Do enough scientists engage in science communication, do you think? Is that part of the issue, that perhaps there aren't enough scientists engaging with the public, sharing their research, their ideas, having a debate or a conversation? They're under pressure to conduct research, publish papers. That's their primary reason for being, if you like. Communication, engaging with the public doesn't seem to be as well rewarded. So how's your experience been when engaging with the scientists? Are they enthusiastic? Do they come to you? Do you feel that things can be done to encourage more scientists to work with you and others, just communicate what they're doing?
Yeah, well, I think that scientists are really prolific on Twitter. I think it's just scientists, journalists, and extremists left on Twitter, if I can be so bold to say that. Scientists are very active on lots of different social media
but
platforms.
But they're usually talking to other scientists, aren't they? They're sharing their work.
And nitpicking as well, a lot of nitpicking.
Yeah.
I would love it if we had more editors at the conversation, so that we could commission more academics and researchers to write more articles. I think that, when we started 12 years ago, it was really difficult convincing people to write for us. Now we get a lot of pitches that we unfortunately have to reject because we've only got 25 editors across the country, and we have to, prioritise what we want to focus on that day and week. And I think that, throughout COVID, a lot of experts had to become media stars overnight, and it was really tricky for some of them. It was a big adjustment. It was also a massive imposition on their life when, they're going through all of this COVID stuff as well, and then they're having to explain it all to the world, and then everyone was so critical of them. And, there was a lot of love as well, and I think that there was a big kind of change in mindset throughout the pandemic as well. A lot of love and support and, genuine interest at the start and following rules. And then as we went along, and when we realised that vaccines weren't going to be the thing that would end the pandemic, you know, things started to go a bit haywire. And so, you know, some scientists, I feel, retreated a little bit more at that time when they started to cop more flack. And, you know, unfortunately, when you have a public profile, you are subject to a lot of bullying and harassment, and particularly if you're a researcher of colour or a woman, or from a minority background. And so I think a lot of experts needed to consider their own well-being at that time, and, you know, some of them did pull back, and for a while it was really hard to commission people to write on COVID. So I feel like we're kind of out of that now, and people have got more of a work-life balance, and, you know, we're just back to a more normal state of living. But yes, I think that there is so much interesting research out there, and some days it's really hard to decide what article or articles I'm going to focus on that day.
Denise, do people react differently to the way that scientists communicate? I mean, social media is a very popular way. People are on other forms of media, on radio, TV, public events like this. Does it make a difference? Do people really want to? How do people want to see the scientist if they're going to trust them?
They're still highly trusted. I mean, there's a lot of polls and things out there that asks, who do we trust? Who are the people that we do trust? And we do still hold a high level of trust within society. I think as people are talking here, I was involved in some conversations recently around women's health and menopause and women's health. And we have some excellent people in Australia actually who are really pushing these fields forward and trying to say, you know, this is something that we need more research in, but also, you know, the equity of women in health science and everything like that needs to be more present, which is amazing. But there was a little bit of I might be being a bit controversial here, being an academic myself, there was this ivory tower kind of attitude coming through as well of, at the time, Davina McCall, you might not know who she is, but she's a celebrity in the UK who's done these science-based programs around women and, you know, their health and what people could do to get through these, you know, very difficult 10 years of your life when you're going through menopause and everything else, and the types of things. So she's her journey as the example. And what was coming through from these academics was very much like, oh, we just need to educate people that they shouldn't be listening to her. They need to listen to us. So again, I think we need to be a little bit humble in the way that we also communicate and understand that the way we communicate these days is completely different. So in order to gain trust, in order to bring people in and get people to believe what we're listening to, the way we do it is really important. And I think that we do need to evolve the way, one, we're measured on how our impact is as academics and as scientists and everything else, but also how we do then engage and listen also to what's going on in the outside world. And I'm talking more around the social science there as well, obviously, beyond what you were saying in terms of in the lab and everything. But even then, we do need to listen to the outside of what is going on, because times and culture has changed. And unfortunately, I think academia needs to shift a little bit with that. We're still very much sometimes in our ivory tower telling people how it should be rather than listening back. And that's where I think we're really in a danger zone at the moment with trust, is if we don't listen and move with the times and reorganise the way we do things and how we communicate, we are actually at danger, even more so, of losing the audience that already is starting to question what's going on in the world and why should they listen to us, really. So we need to shift and also understand what people are wanting. And it's not lies and things, we do need to be open and honest about how we're doing things, but also honest about what drives us. And exactly what you've said there, I mean, I'll go back to the COVID example. We had big money, big farmers that were creating a competition of who could be the first to get that vaccine out, because they knew there was money in it. And that's what the public are seeing as well, is this drive for the dollar. And if money is driving this, is it really about me and my health? And I think that creates a level of mistrust then in what's going on. And in the instance that I've just said there around the, the high-level doctors and menopause, of they should be coming to me. It's like, yeah, but you charge $100 an hour for a consult. There's equity issues there. There's all these other things that you've got to start bringing into why people then aren't going to trust you. They think that it's just about money. You know, unfortunately, we are in Australia where we have public and private. Public, by the way, I think is fantastic in this country. I think it's fabulous. And the things that are going on is amazing. But the money element brings a level of mistrust, as it did in COVID around the big pharma and everything like that, because people just thought it was about the money, it wasn't about the health. I don't believe that. I do think it was about the health, but unfortunately that narrative and what was going on within society definitely influenced people's behaviour and their trust and their belief systems.
Is there a way that we can raise the public profile of scientists? I think if we asked Australians how many scientists they could name, I think we'd struggle, wouldn't we, for them to come up with a reasonable number of scientists. Different when we talk about sport, obviously. Is there some way that we need to, going to your point, Denise, about how we sort of communicate, where there are so many platforms available clearly for scientists to engage, but is that part of the problem? I mean, you know, again, scientists communicate, but how do we know how the general public responds to that? We as part of this event, I put out a short survey and asked people to respond. A common comment was, I just don't know how to make sense of what's being told. Okay, so there's a fundamental issue there.
Yeah, I think the point you raised about taking the general public more seriously, I think that scientists also need to do that, and journalists as well. Like we need to be out there listening to, you know, the genuine questions that people are worried about, and provide good evidence to answer those questions, and not make fun of them and belittle them, and, you know, completely turn them against a whole, you know, network of doctors and scientists and journalists who, you know, strive to tell the truth. You know, we don't want to turn people off by humiliating them, by, you know, making them feel like they're, I don't know, silly for worrying about these things. You know, in COVID it was really important things like, am I going to be able to get pregnant after I have a vaccination? You know, people were hearing anecdotes and, you know, bits of information that sounded plausible, and maybe they were based on a kernel of truth and then taken to the extreme, and then they were just, you know, dismissed as being, you know, a bit woo-woo. And I think that we need to take those people seriously and provide good evidence, good information, and engage with them rather than completely turn them off and lose them forever.
Santa, does your institute have a sort of formal process of supporting researchers in terms of, you know, communicating the research that they do?
Yes, so I think it's the first thing I'd say is that I think, you know, well, firstly, I think our institute sees itself as having, as among its responsibilities, to be open. Our walls are not made of ivory, and we are, although we try our best anyway to be open, and I think it's something that we want to do more of. I think that all academic organisations, universities, the research institutes, even the clinical parts, the research parts of hospitals, you know, we have a responsibility. I think it's driven from, I guess the existential rationale of our organisations ultimately is to serve the public who are investing in it. And that means that the public have a, you know, we have a responsibility to communicate with the public, and they have a right to understand what it is that we do there, in terms of, you know, what the processes are that we follow scientifically, and of course to communicate the findings that we have. So we do have communications specialists who help us synthesize the results of sometimes our very complicated work into something that's digestible for the public, and then to help us communicate that as well. So I think that is important. I think we certainly, one point you made before, which is around, you know, should scientists be out there? I think it's really just that, you know, we see ourselves as a sector within community. And just as the media, the arts, science, business, they're all sectors of community that bring, help the whole of Melbourne or the whole of Australia flourish. We wouldn't flourish without missing any part of this. And that's what and our role there is to ensure that we engage with the broader society to communicate that. And we're learning and trying to continue to do that better.
We're close to time, but could I ask each of you just to give us your thoughts on the possible impact that artificial intelligence is going to have on biomedical research, and what impact you think that might have on just this whole question of trust? I mean, is it a threat? Does it depend on how we communicate it? It's coming, it's here in many respects, and it's perhaps another challenge for the lay public or the general public to wrap their heads around. Fron, do you want to give us your thoughts on what you see coming?
I have a different perspective on the journalism side versus medicine, and maybe it's because I don't understand medicine as much, but I'm really fascinated to hear about the new capabilities in terms of, detecting cancers and other things through AI-assisted imaging. And so, I'm kind of interested to hear about all of the possibilities of what we can use AI for. But then when I think about my industry and journalism, it kind of terrifies me, because you get, these bots making up these horrible, little polls about, women who are murdered and just awful things like that. It just shows you what happens when you let the bots generate their own thing and it's not checked by humans, and it just goes completely awry. And I feel like for big media companies wanting to make a lot of money, cutting out more journalists and replacing them with AI would be, a great option, but it would be the public who misses out, because, it would just be an absolute horror, I think.
Horror. Santa?
Yeah, okay, so I think firstly, there is a great opportunity. It's a tool that we can use in science, and we are using in science. It's used in structural biology, particularly in drug discovery, in analysis of large data sets, both multi-omic sort of, say, wet data sets, as well as data from populations and clinical data. So I think we'll learn a lot from that. Sometimes it tells you exactly what you already knew, but in a far more interesting way. But still, I think it will shed new insights, particularly around some of the biologic discoveries. However, I think that there's the potential. The second half of that question is, you asked about trust. I think we know that now immense amounts of text can be generated at with just a prompt. One of the true skills of a scientist is to be able to write. We write all day and all night. We write papers, we write grants, we write all sorts of other things. So a lot of that is how we fit that into our life, and how that is incorporated into the sort of writing that we have to do, whether it's for manuscripts or for grants or for all sorts of other things that we do. I think that's going to be an interesting question, and where the standards lie around use of that. But the last bit was the general public also ChatGPTing our science. I mean, maybe they'll come up with the right hypothesis and beat us to it, but I think recognising what the public is now, what everyone's doing, because everyone is doing it. It's 10 years, like 3 years, actually last year, everyone was Googling. Now they're going to be ChatGPTing every time they are thinking of something, and so just understanding what the limitations of that are and what people are likely to know when they come into a setting is what I think we'll have to adapt to.
Thank you. Denise?
I completely agree, and I think actually what you've said there in terms of AI assisted is where we should end up. So I think my fear is that there is this fear that it's just going to take over and do everything. It can't. At the end of the day, as humans, we bring a bit of creativity, a bit of design. How much science has actually been from something that didn't happen right, or we did something by mistake, or like you say, that flash of, can I put these two things together? Is our AI going to fully take away some of that creativity that we bring to science? I don't think it can, and I think actually it would make things a very bland place. I also think of something like the film Hidden Figures, where you've got these incredible women who are, you know, in NASA, you know, doing all the math as to how we can get, you know, this spaceship going around the moon, and this computer comes in and takes over. But at the end of the day, what did they do? They went back to the person and the human on the piece of paper. So I think those things, that sense checking, that thing like that, that image of actually, yes, we've got these great tools, use them, but let's keep them in check. Just like us as humans, us as scientists, we have ethics and also that keeps us in check. We need to do the same with the AI. But it's here, and actually it's very good in what it can do, but let's not overreach, and let's be careful where we are using it. It's creeping into a lot of medicine. You know, treatment for depression was one that we saw the other day, and actually let's be careful where we're replacing humans in some of these things as well, because actually there's a real social thing that could be disastrous there. But
Thank you. We're going to throw it over to the audience for some questions now. So we've got a roving microphone. Thank you. If you'll put your hand up and give us your name. And yes. Oh, first question from the microphone as well. There you go.
I've already got the microphone. I may as well make use of it. Hi, my name's Katrina. You've talked a lot about building trust and some of the things that help us build trust. But what about once it's gone, once it's been destroyed? As scientists and someone who's putting out a lot of communications, how do we get people back?
Should I start?
Yeah.
I think that one of the most important things we can do is really celebrate being transparent, talk a lot about our processes, how we do things, say when we got things wrong, be really clear about how we got it wrong and what we're going to do to fix it next time. And I think that as people see how the sausage is made, they understand the process, they know that, you know, we're not hiding anything. I think that that trust can start to come back in the media anyway, and in science and research.
I guess in you know, for researchers that would be a sort of an integrity crisis if something extreme has occurred in the quality of some work, and that does occur and has occurred in Australia. And I think I would agree with your response. It's around having a transparent and rigorous approach to understand what has happened and what the impact of that is on the data and therefore on knowledge as we understand it. And then there is a scientific process around how you handle data that may not be correct in terms of journals, and they may be amended or even the papers may be withdrawn, which means that's something that we no longer accept. So I think having that process, making it transparent, making it public, and then understanding the steps that we would take to address the conditions that allowed that to occur.
Typical behavioural science response, understand the drivers as to why someone is doing what they're doing or why they've have developed this level of mistrust. Because by doing that, we can then actually understand where they're coming from, get the perspectives. And then if it is a case where we're thinking, oh gosh, we need to get that back, we can then also understand what that solution might be or what that intervention could be. Because 9 times out of 10, I guarantee if that is the instance, then it's probably not an educational thing, which is generally what we tend to do, is throw education at it. Which, by the way, don't do myth busting. It's one of the worst things that we can actually do as a community, because what you're actually doing is probably reinforcing the myth. So they're hearing the myth twice, they've already thought it, you've written it down, and then we tell them the other thing. So they've got two things of what they see as the myth and only one of what we actually want. So just go straight in with the what it is. But then again, of course, if the information isn't the driver as to why they've lost the mistrust, we need to actually understand that in order to try and help build that up and do it in the right way that brings people on that journey, and not just shut them down as well, which is what we can do probably a bit too quickly, is just say, well, they're wrong or whatever, but listen and bring it on board.
Thank you. Question? Thank you.
Hi, I've got a couple of questions. I'll start with the first one. We talked a lot about science in a quite generic term and saying, science suffers from mistrust. But would you say, scientists in behavior change, for instance, or environmental scientists suffer from the same mistrust that, biomedical scientists?
God, behavioural science at the moment, to be honest, we're taking a bit of a bashing, let's be honest. Partly the replicability is one of the arguments. So in biomedicine, exactly those things is the expectation is that as a randomised control trial is your gold standard. We're actually in social science. I completely disagree with that. I think actually we need to rethink some of these things, and that comes down to our scientific paradigms and how we think and approach research and everything else. We don't want to go down that route of talking about all of that today, but that definitely plays into that area of trust. I do think that within biomedicine and in all of our sciences, when we call ourselves a science, we should be held to that level of integrity. That's why we have things like ethics in a lot of the places that we work, and we have to access those so that we are judged and made sure that we are doing the right thing by the people that we're doing it for. I have this naivety in many cases that most of us are here to do things for good and the good of the people if we're in the positions that we're in, but that in itself doesn't just create trust. So when someone from our community does create mistrust, which it's happened in behavioural science very publicly recently, where a very well-known person has been found to be exaggerating their research, it impacts us all. But how we actually then rally around and we do create that level of openness to say, this is why, please don't, because of that one bad apple, please don't, lose that mistrust or work with us here. I think as a community, we need to then lean on the mechanisms that really keep us in check. And it does. It keeps us honest, so to speak.
And I'll jump on my second question, which is a bit more frivolous, I guess. But how I wonder whether when you want to create trust or keep trust, and when you think about science as a layperson, you do think about something a little bit obscure. You want to see that they're open, but you don't necessarily want to understand everything, because if I understand everything, that means we're on the same level and I can't create a vaccine. So, how can I trust that you can? So I was wondering whether the way you actually present, your science communication, in a way you need to have a little bit of that stiffness, if that makes sense, that little edge that is a little bit inaccessible for the lay audience. So you want the language, I'm a communicator, so I always make it as easy as possible, but I wonder whether when you really want to keep that trust in check, you might want to just, show that little difference.
No, I think that we should make all of our articles accessible to someone with the education of a 16-year-old. So I think that even if you're communicating really complicated ideas and really complex science, it's often way more difficult to translate all of that scientific language into something that a 16-year-old can understand, but ultimately it can be done. It just takes a lot more work, and I think that if you can't, then there's a problem at some stage. I think that some academics cloak their motherhood statements in technical language or language that people don't understand, and when you try to tease out what they actually mean, it's not super clear, and sometimes I don't think they're super clear. So I think that doing that work is really important, whether it's published for a lay audience or not. I think that scientists need to be able to pass the pub test. They need to be able to explain what they're doing to someone who's had a few beers at the pub.
Another question on that, thank you.
Hi guys, Neil here. I've just got a question on, once again, on the trust issue. I mean, personally, I've got some science training, so I'm a big fan of transparency. But what advice do you give to scientists and people working in science as to how to balance transparency versus fear in that, for example, I'll use COVID as an example. It seemed to me the messaging on masks during COVID changed. Now, the science on masks would not have realistically changed over that period, and the messaging would change because of the political expedient as to, I don't want to tell people they need to wear masks, so we don't have enough masks to go around. But that, of course, in society breeds mistrust, because you're saying, well, hang on a minute, a year ago the scientist was telling me this, and now the scientist is telling me this. They both can't be right because they're opposite. And so what advice do you give scientists dealing with, I don't know whether you call it political pressure or the like, to give a message to the people that, you can see the situation. I suppose there are circumstances where there needs to know the transparency, which I'd prefer, versus that if we tell the public the truth on this particular instance, then that's going to potentially create a panic. Now COVID's maybe an extreme example. We won't have another one for 200 years, hopefully, but that happens all the time as to politically expedient. Yes, everyone should get this test done because it's best public health outcome, but the government can't afford the test, and if we charge the public what the test is worth, that creates an equity problem. So rather than saying everyone should get the test because it'll drop mortality by 20%, we won't tell them that, even though it's true.
Do you want me to have a go at that? So I think, the COVID is a special example, but it's not rare that knowledge or understanding evolves and opinions ideally should adapt with the change in knowledge. And that is not the big journals every week publish trials where something that we used to think was true now, according to that set of experiments, that randomized trial, for example, is no longer true, or vice versa. And so clinically we adapt to that, and we change our advice, or we judge it, and we change our recommendations. But normally no one really, we don't get to go on the news and tell everyone. It's just how we respond to individual patients and how we practice, or we wait for a consensus to come out amongst a group of us, a group of experts, say clinical experts or other, and we then would provide that advice. So that happens routinely in clinical medicine. But of course, with the pandemic, it was happening in real time and publicly. And I think that, so I firstly think that is a pretty extreme but very high pressure and memorable example. I think what's important is when people change their mind, or they change their advice, that is to say, they need to articulate why. What has changed and what they understand. What knowledge has changed and what influenced them to make that change in their opinion. And then people can take the final point of what they're now saying, together with the journey that the person who's maybe changed that opinion has been on to inform them to change that view.
Another question?
Yes.
Thank you.
I'm not a scientist, but I am a member of the public. And I asked the question, not because we have doctors in the family, but because I haven't gotten an answer anywhere. So I do trust science, so I'm asking scientists, can you tell me the efficacy of the vaccines in COVID that I've taken 5 of, and when will the 6th one be coming out? But again, I haven't heard how long did the 1st one, 2nd one, 3rd one, 4th one, 5th one last. And there are many other members that I've been talking to that are wondering about the same question.
So I'll answer it briefly, just to say, no, I'm not going to share that because that's not my skill set. And I think there are probably better people, although maybe not on this panel, to give you that piece of information. But I'm not a COVID scientist or an immunologist or a vaccine person. And I think maybe to just expand on that, my hesitance to answer that question is that actually I think that's important that people answer what they know. And if I told you something now, I wouldn't say that I'm the world expert on that answer. I'm a clinician, so I have some knowledge similar to your GP or to somebody else. But you're asking, I think what you need is an expert response to that, and I can't provide it.
But there have been no other responses that I can remember out there from anyone answering that question.
Yeah, I mean, it might be a good article for the conversation.
Yeah, we've certainly
It's a
done
good
articles
question.
on how long immunity lasts and what the data that we have available is saying. So, yes, search our website and you will find some not up-to-date answers on the vaccines that are coming out in a couple of weeks' time, but you'll find, a summary of the evidence that we have on the previous vaccines.
But that's, I suspect that's a common question that a lot of people would have. Okay,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
the question is there a central source, whether it's a government website or health department website that, it's a common question.
Yeah.
Let's respond to this common
Yeah,
question
so that-
because we know
yeah.
there's a lot of people are asking this question.
So
We
I
as
will
scientists
provide-
might
yeah,
have a different
yeah.
perspective.
So I think in Australia, the clearinghouse for that question would be the ATAGI. So I don't want to spell out the acronym in front of everyone, but if you just look up ATAGI, they are the peak body of a combination of different types of expert who evaluate the evidence around the vaccines and provide, they actually support, if you like, they're the expert group that advises part of the government in how they come up with these decisions, and they do have updated advice continuously on their website that does deal with that question.
I think it raises the question, though, of how do we engage the public in these types of things? So is there a forum where people can, if everyone asked a question, we'd be completely overwhelmed, but, are there forums where people can actually access or pose these questions so that then they can be answered through, public forums and things like that? Because obviously you're not the only one that's probably wondering this. Like we said about the pregnancy question of or I'm trying to get pregnant during COVID, what can I do? The Googling, we can look at Google searches and you can generally get a sense of what a lot of people are trying to ask. So do we have mechanisms in place where we're listening to the public now and then being able to provide the answers so people aren't going and trying to find things that probably aren't as rigorous or scientific or based that's there? And I don't actually know, but maybe that's another thing as a community that we need to look at to try and provide spaces where people can ask questions of people if they're sat wondering it, because you won't be the only person, I guarantee, and you've started me thinking now,
But also, if I could just add to that, like ATAGI is the best source of information, but it's also really dense.
It's very
and some
technical.
of the language they use, even today in the vaccine, guidelines, it's from September, but for the new vaccine, they're just, saying it again. They're talking about, you're recommended to have a vaccine, and then some age groups may consider having a vaccine, and then for some other age groups you can't have one, it's not recommended. But even their language, it's very specific, and they absolutely have to use that language, but it can just seem a bit inaccessible if you don't know why are they saying it like that, and so can I actually get one or can I not? And I just saw a really great kind of flow chart from them today, and it spells out, it's colour coded, it's traffic light. If you're this age group, you can have it. If you're this age group with an underlying condition, it's orange, and so you can get it if you decide. And then if it's green, you should get it. They recommend it. I found that really useful, and I put it in my article today, and I'm hoping that people will read it. But yeah, it is really hard to get information about who can get vaccinated and who can't. And I think even some pharmacists struggle with that.
And there is a no-do gap. So information is changing, like you said, and how can we expect everyone to be completely up to date all of the time? My goodness, our clinicians on the front line are pretty, under the pump most of the time. So the expectation then that they're going to read however many articles and things like that is huge, it's ridiculous. So there is a bit of a no-do gap in terms of how much people do know and then how they can act on it. So there will always be these gaps in information that will rarely be plugged, but can we be more efficient and effective in how we do communicate the information? Like you say, that's a really nice way of engaging someone in and making it easy for the understanding. So again, in behaviour change, if we can do 10 things, make the first 9, make it easy, and we're more likely to get people to engage in the information that we want.
And also being a multicultural community, there's that added issue of getting it out to a wider group. I mean, I guess you are able to have translate functions on websites, but how many people will go to an Otago website and look up? So there's...
Yeah, and the delays during COVID to get things translated, it was appalling.
That's an aspect we haven't discussed, but again, an important part of just generally getting the community to engage. There's another question?
Did you want to ask an online one?
No, we'll take the question here. Thank you.
Stuart from the University of Melbourne. Denise, I was really interested in the point you were talking about, that trusted communication requires candid expression of uncertainty and nuance. But that sort of conflicts with the way that health departments want to communicate certainty or reassurance. And they often want to say, yes, this is definitely safe, or, this is absolutely this. Mm-hmm. How do they... I guess resolve that conflict of wanting to reassure people at the same time as saying, actually, we're not quite sure about this. There is we think this, but there's some uncertainty about it.
Gosh, I've got to be careful here, haven't I, if I create a rod for my own back with some of the stuff I'm probably saying. I think we expect our departments and people to have the answers. Certainly in certain instances, I want to be able to go to the website, get the answer that I want, and I want it here now, and all these things. So the expectation is around that. I think that the element of risk and trying to negate risk within communication is still overriding actually being honest about what we do and we don't know. I think, you look at the Environmental Protection Agency, all of these things, they take that level of, risk communication, chance isn't really there, and actually we need to move away from that. I think that means that people are scared to actually tell the truth sometimes, because the expectation is that we should have the answers. I'm trying to think of a word, and it's leaving my brain at the moment, but compliance. There we go. So we also have a level of risk matrices and compliance in terms of how we communicate things. So we want people to do a certain thing. We want people to act a certain way. We use these types of this thinking also then within our communication to try and reduce the risk. Maybe no, it wasn't compliance, sorry, I've used the wrong word there. But it is basically, we use risk matrices, and the way we communicate and everything else sort of comes within that of how we can negate these things. I think we need to have a bit more trust in our communications and how we do speak to the public, and when we don't need to say that we completely don't know the answers, but bring them along on the journey. And have a little bit more openness and honesty. So I personally, oh gosh, they're going to watch it, aren't they? Department of Health, unless you've got an in, you can't get into that place. Who do you ring to ask a question? How do you do things? How do you want to get more information about a report that's been published? It's really, really difficult to do. So again, if you've got questions about things, it's difficult to actually access those types of areas. So I think the idea is that unless something is completely polished or that we sound like we know all the answers, we won't put that information out. Where actually, I think if you, and this is me personally in some instances with a little bit of information in the background, that we probably can be a little bit more cautious. But the way it's done, so the way we communicate things, rather than using language that is so definitive, we can actually probably, bring in people. We've got communication specialists who support most of our work these days. How can we actually learn from them about how we do communicate things rather than being so definitive? Because it all changes. Medicine over the last 20, 30, 40 years has completely changed. We were definitive back then, we're definitive now. What we need to say is that we're in evolving time. Things are changing as we live. What was right then is not right now. So being open and honest about that, and in our narratives, I think is really important moving forward. Because unfortunately, everything is now stored. people can go back 20, 30, 40 years and look at what it was then to what it is now. We do it as scientists. We look at the previous data, you know, the peer-reviewed articles from the 70s, 80s, 90s to what it is now. And we can't dismiss that. The public can look all that stuff up. It's not like we're living in the 1900s now where actually there was a lack of public records that people couldn't access. We're living in a different time where people do fact check and they check out all the information that's out there. So if we're not open and honest about our communications and how they are out there, then people will have a level of mistrust. And also, if we're not showing where we're getting our information from, again, people can start plugging those gaps, which is what we don't want to do. I've probably thrown myself completely under the bus there about 10 occasions, but you know, I think we as a community do need to do a little bit more in being a little bit more open and honest about the work that is we do within the science fields.
I have a question from an online question for the panel. Could trust be improved if interested members of the public were able to participate in setting biomedical research and development priorities? How would barriers to such engagement be surmounted? Santa?
Yeah, I can respond to that. So we're in an era where that is coming, or it's already here. So we have, there is there's deepening consumer input, we would say, into all aspects of the way that we consider our science. So firstly, for example, at WeHi, many of the labs that work on particular diseases or conditions have consumers who are affected by those conditions who actually meet with our scientists and inform them on how they would prioritise the work that's happening in that lab and how any sort of direction of the work in that lab might influence their health. In terms of grant funding bodies, we're now often expected to have input from consumers into the project and the program and how it might relate to their well-being and how they assess it. And indeed, on some grant panels, which is, you know, where I guess you could say grant panels are where the nation decides where to prioritise what's going to be done scientifically. Consumers sit on those grant panels and they inform how those decisions are made. I think that will that approach will grow over time, and there's also been strong efforts to include consumers in the strategy around some of the big grant programs in Australia as well. So I think that that's an important piece. It helps us prioritise so that we are meeting the expectations and needs of the community. But it also is incumbent on scientists to communicate that even if they're doing something so basic or esoteric, seemingly esoteric that it may not immediately change a beneficiary's health in weeks, months or years, that they can see that there could be a fundamental change that changes all of health through those discoveries. So I think we need to be able to communicate both stories and then engage, and yes, that engagement with consumers is ongoing.
Fron, do you want to make a comment, Denise?
No, I don't have anything to add.
It's probably the only thing I probably will say is you do need to do that very carefully. You know, I've had panels, we've run patient panels where if you leave it open and don't provide good guidance, you know, the top of mind issues come to you know, out. So if you have something around hospitals, bed numbers, the time in ER, all of those things, you know, and I'm not getting into the biomedical here, but in terms of the use of spaces, because it is important to individuals, but if we were going to really invest money, there might be other areas. So guidance and support and a bit of, this is where education will play a part of giving those individuals the information they need in order to make informed decisions on grants and everything like that is really important. So it's not just we'll just throw some people in. It needs to be a really considered process to make sure that people have the tools in order to properly engage and don't feel like just a tick box.
Thank you, Denise. We've had an interesting discussion this evening. I hope that the panel has perhaps left some questions for you to ponder. We've tackled a complex question. There are many stakeholders who are involved in this, but it's something of really paramount importance for the biomedical sciences community and just us as a as a community as well. So I hope that the conversation has been worthwhile, it's been beneficial, and hopefully it may have impacted the way you think about this issue. So I want to end by thanking the panel for making the commitment to come and engage with us this evening. It's a great example of, I think, what we could do more of. I want to thank each of you for again for your contribution. So let me thank you. Thank you. I'm going to send an email out tomorrow to those of you that registered for a short survey. We like to get your feedback. It does help, believe me, it does help the way we hold these events and the topics that we will choose to highlight next year. So if you could take 2 minutes of your time, I'd be very grateful to have your feedback, please. And I also need to give a plug to our sponsors. They make these events possible. Without their contribution, we wouldn't be here tonight. We wouldn't be able to record the event and have it on our website for others to share. So again, thank our sponsors for their commitment to science communication. This is the final event for the year, so I'd like to wish you all a happy and safe festive season and new year. I look forward to seeing you in 2024. Thank you and good evening. Thank you.